gentlemen, thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule to join today's discussion on democracy, human rights, and geopolitics. Basically, we are robbing you of your weekend. Sorry for that. Where the dialogue is co-organized by the Center for New Inclusive Asia in Malaysia and the Global Governance Institution in China. We are happy to see a strong panel of scholars from Italy, Portugal, Russia, Sri Lanka, Turkey, the US, China, and Malaysia. I'm Xu Qingdong from the Center for New Inclusive Asia, or CNA. Today, I will play the role of moderating discussion. And for the purpose of having a smooth discussion, I would ask you to mute your mic when other speakers do their presentation. And if you have any questions, you may leave your question in the chat section. So we will try to have the speakers answer your questions afterwards. Today we have two sessions, with the first one focusing on geopolitics behind this democracy summit, and the other on the case study about human rights in Xinjiang in association with the so-called Uyghur Tribunal from legalistic perspective. Without further ado, let's kick off our discussion. First, I would like to introduce Mr. Ko King Ki, President of the Center for New Inclusive Asia, to give us a welcome address. Qingqi, please.
Thank you, Chandra. Captain Tian Sichen, President of Global Governance Institution, distinguished speakers, participants, ladies and gentlemen. Good afternoon and a very warm welcome to all the participants of the dialogue. To the distinguished speakers, our sincere thanks to you for taking time to join this dialogue and share your expert views and insights on democracy, human rights, and big power competition. There are three topics for deliberation today, but the key topic to be discussed is democracy. As human right is fundamental to democracy, and as US President Joe Biden sees it, big power competition between US and China is a competition between democracy and autocracy. According to Joe Biden, the US must win in this competition to show that democracy is a better governance system that can deliver. A couple of days ago, on December 9 and 10, Joe Biden convened a virtual summit for democracy to prove that democracy works and to strengthen democracy and counter authoritarianism, fight corruption, and promote respect for human rights. Some critics, however, aptly describe the summit as a summit for virtual democracy, as nothing concrete has come out of it. The definition and interpretation of democracy have long been the monopoly of the West. The word democracy actually comes from the Greek word demos, meaning people, and kratos, meaning power. So democracy can be interpreted as people's power. In Chinese, the term for democracy is Mingzhu, meaning the people are masters. The world has long been indoctrinated by the West that democracy means one person, one vote. Periodic election of government is a must to qualify as the democracy. However, the large majority of the people do not hold power in these systems. Elites do. A 2014 study in US showed that only the richest 10% of the population seems to have any causal effect on public policy. The other 90% is left with democracy by coincidence, that is, getting what they want only when they happen to want the same thing as the people calling the shots. According to Helen Landemore, author of the book Open Democracy and Political Theorist in Yale University, representative government historically favor the idea of people's consent to power over that of people's exercise of power. She pointed out that an authentic democracy would center on ordinary citizens rather than elected politicians. Electoral representation is not the only, let alone the most democratic form of representation. democracy must be more deliberative and participatory. Furthermore, interpretation of democracy is strikingly similar to the whole process people's democracy promulgated by President Xi Jinping. During an inspection tour in Shanghai in 2019, President Xi said China's political system is a whole process democracy. It encompasses the idea that China's one-party political system is a unique application of democratic principles, one which empowers the people to get involved in the country's decision-making and governance at all levels, which is more participatory than Western democratic system. The whole process people's democracy, as it is now known, is in fact rooted in the people-centered governance principle of the Communist Party of China. China's democracy is people's democracy. People are masters of the country, as what democracy is understood in Chinese, that is 民主. Democracy is a means, not an end. It is a means to bring good life to all citizens. Democracy should not exist just in form, but must be substantive. So is human rights. Human rights is about policies and measures which will improve the quality of life and standard of living of the people, not just slogans and empty talks. The priority of human rights concerns should be ensuring that people have enough food to eat, have clean water, decent housing, healthcare, and education. Human rights is nothing but high-sounding political rhetoric if people have to sleep on the streets, suffer from poverty, hunger, and fall sick without public health care. China's achievements in human rights are manifested in the lifting of 800 million people out of poverty, improving the literacy rate from 20% to 96%, and increasing the life expectancies of its people from 33 years to 77 years during the rule of the Communist Party of China. America has now blatantly weaponized human rights by accusing China of genocide in Xinjiang. This is but a well-planned scheme to destabilize Xinjiang in furtherance of its geopolitical interests and part of America's global strategy to contain China's rapid rise. US-China competition is not a competition between democracy and autocracy, as Joe Biden alleged. It is but a test of which interpretation of democracy is correct, China's or America's. I'm sure history will have an unbiased answer. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Qingqi, for your speech, in which basically put democracy at the center of our argument for the session when we started. So let's dive into our discussion, which should be exciting about the debates of the ideas. First, we have Dr. Gail Luft, who is the co-director at Institute for the Analysis of Global Security, Washington, USA. He's also a professor at Austin Technical University in Turkey. Mr. Luft specializes in geopolitics, geoeconomics, energy security, Middle East, and US-China relations. Newsweek magazine called him a tireless and independent advocate of energy security, and Esquire magazine included him in its list of America's best and brightest. So, Dr. Gail Luft, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. It's an honor to be with you all. This week has been a very challenging week I think for China, because we had two separate incidents that are directly correlated. One is the Summit for Democracy, and the other one was this attempt to boycott the Olympics in Beijing, the Winter Olympics, which has turned out to be a flop, because other than the usual suspects, nobody really joined this diplomatic boycott. But nevertheless, I think that sort of puts China in sort of an alarmist mode. China feels that the world democracies are ganging up on it, and it feels the need to defend itself. And I suspect that many of the activities we've seen in China and outside of China, sort of the anti-summit of democracy, had to do with China trying to make the case that what the US is trying to portray it in a negative light, it's not really the case. And there are more than one way of looking at democracy and human rights. Now, first of all, I would say to China, chill. You know, everything that you see happening now has to do with one word. It's called jealousy. China is successful. China is prosperous. China is lifting more and more people from poverty. China is investing in its neighborhood and in other parts of the world. The West is confused. The West is unable to get its act together and speak in one voice. The West is facing many problems that have to do with cultural disorientation and political atrophy. And of course, a lot of it is being channeled into this type of conversation about our system is superior to yours, etc., and who's writing the rules of the road and everything that we've been hearing all along. So I would say, you know, when people are going after your values, and it means that that's the only weapon that they have left. And one of the things I want to point out is that, you know, you want to ask yourself, do Americans really care about democracy and human rights, or is it only the government? Because you have to separate between America and Americans, okay? The fact that Washington is doing certain things doesn't mean that this is a sort of the highest priority for the American people. And also we want to ask ourselves, why is it happening now? I mean, 4 years of Donald Trump, we barely heard about democracy, we barely heard about human rights. The only thing, by the way, that we heard a lot during the Trump administration was religious freedom. And why? Because there are 70 million evangelical Christians in America who are the base of the Republican Party, and they care about religious freedom. And that's why it was a big issue at that time. But we didn't hear much about criticism of human rights, and it all sort of began to unravel when after the pandemic started and Joe Biden came into power. I would say that overall, I think Americans don't care very much about the state of human rights and democracy around the world. In fact, most of them think that their own democracy doesn't work. And that has been shown time and again in various opinion polls, that Americans have a very poor image of their own system. So, you know, obviously, when you're not happy with your own system, who are you to go and lecture to the rest of the world about how their system is functioning? And when we talk about systems, I want to point out the one thing, and I think that the opening remarks were spot on. Democracy is not an end, it's a means. It's a form of government. But what is the role of government? That's what we need to ask. What is the role of government? The role of government is to give you good life, to give you security, to give you the ability to walk at night in the street without being afraid of that you are murdered or your children are kidnapped and so forth. So the good life, and there are a lot of good things go into the good life, and every culture has its own definition what the good life is. But you know, the pandemic has gave us a very, very interesting opportunity because the COVID-19 pandemic is the first time in human history, in which all of humanity, all of the countries of the world are facing the exact same challenge at the exact same time. We've never had something like this. You know, in the past, you had a natural disaster in one part of the world, and a few years later, another part of the world. And we could see how different countries, different governments, different forms of government are dealing with this. But we never had this sort of beauty contest. We never had all of the countries standing on the same stage, being able to demonstrate how they take care of their people. And the pandemic is the first time that we have this opportunity to compare, this sort of what I call the beauty contest. And when we look at this beauty contest, we see that democracies have performed horribly, horribly. In fact, more than 80% of the people that died from COVID-19 around the world were living, unfortunately, no longer in democracies. More than 80% of the people that died from COVID, more than 5 million people that are already dead, were residents of democratic states. So when it came to the ultimate test of protecting your life, defending you from enemy, doesn't matter if it's a virus or a nuclear bomb, the democracies failed. So to me, when I look at it, I say, what do I want from my government? Only one thing I want from my government. Main thing is protect me, defend me from this, from that. And when this stretch test occurred, the results are not very good, unfortunately. And I think there are 194 countries around the world that are looking at all of this, and they're saying, okay, what are they talking about? Democracy, but do we like what we see? And I think that the issue is here that when you try to dictate or install a certain software on a certain culture, on a certain people, it's like trying to install an operating system of a Mac on a PC. It doesn't work, and we've seen time and again the United States. I still remember George W. Bush saying, "Oh, we're going to go to Iraq. We're going to bring them the democracy. We're going to liberate them from their terrible leadership that we have." And 1 million people later, dead, many tragedies. You all know the stories, and we've seen it time and again. We've seen it in Libya. We've seen it in Egypt. We've seen it in many countries where the sort of imperialistic mindset of we're going to come and show you what's good for you, when our own system, our own people are not even satisfied with what we have, that brings to one disaster after another. And when I look at China, well, these guys have been around 5,000 years. They've made every single mistake that is possible. There have been so many tragedies. You've been around, you're America, you're barely 250 years. Most of this time, you were not even a democracy, because there was still slavery and racial discrimination. You're the new kid in the block. Now, who are you to come and lecture to a culture of 5,000 years that have done all the experimentations and suffered so much? And you think that you can sort of come with a magic wand and show them what's good for them? And I just want to leave you with one point. Let's say that let's just in theory, okay, it's not going to happen, but let's say that you somehow convince 1.4 billion Chinese that your system is better and they should move from the current system to their own, to the system that reflects the sort of the Western style democracy. What do you think will happen? What is this democracy going to look like? Have you ever seen one American scholar, one magazine article trying to describe what a Chinese system would look like if it was a democracy? Nobody's giving a thought to this. It's sort of like, let's break it and then figure out what to do. And I think it's intellectual laziness that we see today in Washington, that is break, but don't give any thought about what's going to happen after. So you broke Iraq, you broke Afghanistan, you broke Libya, you broke, I can go on and on. But then who's there to pick up the pieces? So, okay, this is theory. It's not going to happen. China is strong. China doesn't need lecturing. I think the point that I want to leave you with is this. This is all hot air. Chill, relax. Every country, every society will figure out its way based on its culture, based on its family values, based on its social structure, based on its economic development. This is the journey that every society needs to go through. And this notion that you can come and install a certain software, it will never work. Now, what China needs to do, only one thing: show that your own people are happy. If your own people are happy, if they feel that you're doing a good job, if they see that their life is better than their parents and their children will have a better life and a longer life, by the way, then all the rest is meaningless. Okay, so actions speak louder than words. And every country in the world will be watching and making its own judgment, not waiting for Washington to tell them what is the right answer. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Gail Luft. Interesting question. You asked the question, what if China adopted the US style system? What will happen? Some Chinese would say probably China will be a larger Iraq. Today, let's move on. We have Dr. Chandra Muzaffar, the president of the International Movement for a Just World, an international NGO based in Malaysia, which seeks to critique global injustice and to develop an alternative vision of a just and compassionate civilization guided by universal spiritual and moral values. As author and editor for 32 books in English and Malay, many of Dr. Chandra Muzaffar's writings have been translated into other languages. So Dr. Chandra, please.
Peace be with you. I'd like to begin by thanking the organizers for this kind invitation. I've been asked to look at small states, Muslim countries, within this context of democracy and big power competition. Before I focus upon my topic, let me say this, that the global system is in a mess, that international politics is in a state of crisis. That crisis is not caused by what the Western media tells us. It's because Russia is about to gobble up Ukraine, or because China may attack Taiwan. That those are not the reasons why the world is in a mess. It is in a mess, and this must be emphasized over and over again, because the United States of America and its allies are determined to perpetuate the existing order which allows them to dominate and to control the planet. In other words, they want to ensure that they remain the hegemonic power in the world, which is a role that they have played with varying degrees of success over the last few decades. They want to perpetuate that hegemony. They feel that hegemony is being threatened because realities are changing. The power structure is changing because new centers of power are emerging, new relationships are being forged, and the United States is worried that it will lose its grip, it will lose its dominant position. That is the underlying cause for the global crisis. Now, let me look at small states and Muslim countries, the topic I've been given, within this context. I want to be very candid with you. While there have been some successes, small countries, Muslim states have benefited in small ways from the existing order, the order after the Second World War. The fact is that by and large, they have suffered under this system. They have been witnesses to and victims of wars. The Korean War, the Vietnam War, millions dead, hundreds of thousands maimed and injured as a result of these wars, fought in Asia, small countries, middling powers. We're also aware that there have been attempts to usurp the resources of the small states, what had happened to Iraq, to other countries in West Asia, in North Africa. This is the reality. The reality is that governments have been ousted, dictators have been installed, dictators, mind you, installed by the world's leading democracy in order to perpetuate that democracy's interests. That has happened over and over again, from Lebanon to the Congo, to Chile, to Nicaragua, to any number of states. This is the reality. This is what has been happening to small states, to Muslim countries, and so on. We're also aware of the other inequities and injustices, vast gaps between rich and poor. It has become worse over the decades, greater concentration of wealth, greater control over the global financial system, attempts to control strategic routes, everything on behalf of the dominant hegemon and its allies. This is the reality. We cannot say that it has been a happy time for us. We have suffered a great deal. We've paid in terms of lives, paid in terms of our resources. We've paid in terms of not just our future. We have even had to mortgage our heritage, our past. Look at what had happened to Syria, what had happened to Libya in terms of their heritage, because they had been conquered at some point on. This is the reality. Now, I was also asked to look at the attitude towards Muslim countries, and we have to talk invariably about Islamophobia. Islamophobia is actually a continuation of something that has happened for a long while. The fear of Islam is rooted in history for hundreds of years, and the root cause again is related to power. The West began to react this way to Islamic civilization from the 9th and 10th centuries onwards, because Islam is the only non-Western civilization that has conquered and occupied parts of Europe. It never happened to them before. They've conquered others, but they've never been occupied and conquered by another civilization. So that fear of Islam, an irrational fear, has remained for a long while, because the reality is the two civilizations have interacted positively right through history, absorbed from one another. But what is emphasized is this misplaced fear of Islamic civilization. And as a result of that, you have political problems in various parts of the world. Friends, if this is the reality that confronts us, small states, Muslim countries, is there any hope? Now, the rise of China is unique. First time that a power has come up to challenge the existing order without violence and bloodshed. And it is a challenge which is extraordinary for various reasons. It's not just a question of trade, investments. It's not just a question of China's emergence in terms of finance and other aspects of the economy, it is China's rise also as a political power, which is a consequence of these changes that are taking place. But most of all, friends, something which is not emphasized except in some circles, the rise of China is a rise brought about by its mastery of science and technology. As at all times in history, it is one's control over science and technology that makes one a superpower. And China's mastery over science and technology, not just your 5G, not just exploring the other side of the moon, space, technology, and all the rest of it, it is the totality of China's rise in science and technology. And the West knows that this means that they cannot dominate the world anymore. It's China, science, and technology. This is an observation which the Muslim reformer in the 19th century, Sayyid Jamaluddin al-Afghani, made a long time ago. The secret of success of power, as it was in the case of Islam in the past, and every civilization, is science and technology. So this is unstoppable, the rise of China. It is irreversible. And this is the reason why countries have begun to feel that there is some breathing space. The rise of China is not something which is just theoretical. It is very concrete. Because if you look at the Belt Road Initiative, it is an attempt to translate China's rise into something that means change, positive change for a lot of other people in other parts of the world. And it's based upon an ancient idea, the Silk Road, which interestingly was a very important combination of forces between Chinese civilization and various Islamic polities. Just one very important aspect of the Silk Road. And this is being reborn. It is something which the Chinese are determined to do to ensure that the Silk Road becomes a reality, both a maritime reality and land reality. And it's going to change the world. And this has given us hope, all of us. Infrastructure development, changes in our social structure, our ability to link up with others, it's going to be very, very critical for the future. So while we welcome this, let us also remind ourselves, small states, and I would include even China, though it's a big state, China should also remind itself that as these changes take place, let us not commit colossal blunders that will derail us. We must avoid this at all costs. And what would be the greatest blunder? It is to fail in governing our societies well. Let me sort of make a couple of points very quickly that I wanted to. Now, if you look at some of the major issues in international politics over the last few decades, the role played by citizens groups, the people, it has been overlooked. To give you one example, the mass mobilization of citizens all over the world against the Iraq war, that was unprecedented. And it was in the interests of the dominant powers to snuff out the impact of what had happened. But what had happened in 2003, at one point you had 50 million people all over the world taking part in different sorts of activities connected with the Iraq war. Now, it's that sort of mass mobilization which I think is very important in terms of bringing about changes to the international system. Basically, when we take a position against a hegemonic global system, we're asking for changes to the international system. We're asking for greater multilateralism, for instance, different centers of power. It won't come about easily, and it will not come about through the UN Security Council or through the generosity of the big powers. It has to come from people's groups as one of many avenues. And this is why I think we should understand the value of this sort of mobilization. Take another example, the global movement against apartheid. It was not the governments. The United States and Britain were very slow in responding to this struggle against apartheid at the global level. It came from citizens groups. And even in the case of the United States of America, it was church groups and other citizens groups that were in the forefront at the beginning. So what I'm saying is some citizens groups have a role to play in trying to reshape the international system, but they haven't realized this potential. And let me say this in all frankness, that I don't think the Chinese government understands this at all. The Chinese government, and I think Chinese society as a whole, does not have an inkling of how citizens groups can function and how they can mobilize and bring about change, because it doesn't happen within post-1949 China. And this is the reason why I think we should try to convey this. If we want to have change in the international system, citizens groups must also play a role. And I can think of a few other issues where the stances taken by citizens groups have had some impact. Minimal, but nonetheless, this is the sort of direction in which we should work, apart from other things that we have talked about in the course of the evening, all the other examples we've given. So I would want to make that point about the role of citizens groups in bringing about changes to the international system. And here we're talking about a hegemonic system and the fear that people have that this hegemonic system will be replaced by another hegemonic system. I do not think so. I do not think that this will happen. But on the other hand, mass participation by citizens groups, multiple centers of power, and perhaps a very diffused notion of global power and institutions that reflect this diffuse nature of power. I think these are some of the contours of the future. And we should be looking at this in order to understand what is happening. Thank you.
Yes, let's proceed to the next speaker, Admiral Professor Jayanath Kalmbach, the Director General of Institute of National Security, Sri Lanka. He is the current Permanent Secretary of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, prior to which he served as Additional Secretary to the President of Foreign Relations. He is also currently serving in the advisory board of Sea and Coast Maritime Magazine. So Professor Kalmbach, please.
Good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. I'm talking to you from Hawaii. I just managed to come on time. So today we are talking about this geopolitical approach to human rights, democracy, and big power competition. So let me start. There was this democracy summit conducted by USA very recently. 100 countries were invited, or rather world leaders were invited. But when you look at the list, some of the countries, the human rights record is really bad. But they were also invited, and there are democracies, not democracies, but they were also invited to participate in this summit. If you look at the world, 193 countries, so only 51.8%. So there is a clear division in the world now. 51.8% was invited to the summit, and the rest, like Sri Lanka, China, and many other countries, are not invited. Now, Sri Lanka is one of the oldest democracies in Asia. It's a functioning democracy, one of the oldest functioning democracies, and we have conducted free and fair elections certified by European monitors. And we have a functioning judiciary, and there is complete freedom of speech, freedom of press, everything is there, but still we are not considered as a democracy. So what do we do? Now, this is actually raising a very big question as to who decide what is a democratic country and what is the real criteria for this selection is a problem. Now, when someone is deciding, oh, you are democratic, you are not, actually it is creating a division. In my opinion, it should be the people of that particular country should decide whether you are a democracy or not from outside. It should be the people. Now, this summit very clearly, unfortunately, has divided the world. What we need is to unify the world, to be one common humanity. But we are trying to divide by various other ways. I think we should not divide like this. And also democracy. I mean, democracy is, we all like democratic freedom. We like freedom of speech, freedom of thought, freedom of, to express ourselves, we all like it. But then there cannot be one size fit all for the whole world. It is basically up to individual countries to select the system of governance which is befitting your own country. It is not one size fit all. It cannot happen that way. It is the people and the country and the government should decide what is right and what is wrong. And especially if you look at whole of Asia, not a single country had been developed through 100% democratic system. It has developed because there are other systems. So therefore, this democracy is the only answer. I don't think we can really agree on. Now, on the big power competition, we know that there is competition for power and influence. Power is, of course, there are three different types of powers: economic, military, and diplomatic. And all these three powers are used by major players in the country, major powers, to coerce, to influence, to pass their opinion on to the others. And maybe even through soft power, right? Yeah, like maybe giving aid, like giving a grant. You know, these type of power and influence are there in the world. Now, my argument is world should be divided. There are common threats to the world, like pandemic, right? And like global warming and climate change, extreme weather events, poverty alleviation. These are common threats to the humanity. So we need to be really united in fighting that. We need to be focusing on common prosperity and not mutual destruction. You know, we know that the geopolitical and geostrategic competition is actually destroying the world because it is creating division. We need inclusivity, not exclusive clubs. We need everyone to be inclusive. Then on the human rights, very quickly, you know, by being born as human, we have rights, and we all like it. We like to live a free, exercise our freedom, to study, to live in a house, to have a family. We all like that. There cannot be anything away from human rights. But we need to respect human rights. To me, human right is like a flower. Right? First, you have to plant a seed, and then the tree has to grow. Tree has to give rise to branches, and the branches will give a flower. So human right is like a flower. But before growing the tree, if you say human rights, it won't work. So therefore, I think without development, we cannot really have human rights. And also, when you talk about human rights, there is another very important aspect. To me, right to life is more important than human rights. Right to life. I re-emphasize right to life. We know terrorism is destroying life. Sri Lanka experienced 30 years of a difficult war, and China, Xinjiang province, and other places experienced terrorism until about 2016. Then terrorism is really destroying the world. They are taking the lives away from the people. They are killing people arbitrarily, indiscriminate bombing. So therefore, I think right to life is the bounded duty of any legitimate government, any legitimate country, because first you must ensure that the people can live freely, and people can live, and then only they can safeguard human rights, they can enjoy human rights. But then unfortunately, in the world today, the victim of terrorism after a while become the bad guy, and the perpetrators of terrorism become the good guys. So this is actually a problem Sri Lanka is also experiencing in the United Nations Human Rights Commission, and we are very grateful China is standing by with us. You know, we have to respect the international system. We have to respect the sovereignty, and we have to respect the non-interference in the domestic internal matters of another country. And we don't want any other mechanism outside the UN Charter. Right now, what we see is this mechanism, that mechanism. So these are not sanctioned by the UN Charter. The UN Charter respects sovereignty, non-interference. These are the things that we should uphold. We should not allow any other mechanism to take place. And we need to work together. We need to work as one humanity. We need to work as a group of countries in order to achieve a better life, development, and then human rights, then democratic values. all that will come. But first, we must get together and fight these immediate threats that I mentioned earlier are persisting in the world today. So with this, I terminate my talk, and thank you very much for inviting me to be with you. All the best.
Thank you, Professor Kalmbach, and also our thanks to Dr. Chandra, who was almost finishing his speech before the disconnection happened over there. And Professor Kalmbach's speech is, reminded us of the importance of being inclusive, in particular at the time. Basically, we face the common challenges of this pandemic, this virus, and also climate change. Without winning this struggle or the war against the climate change, basically every country will suffer, every individual will suffer. What's the point of say, geopolitical competition? Probably it becomes much less meaningful in winning or losing in this competition. Because of the time limit, Qingqi, shall we continue with the next session, and then we come back to have some commentary and then question and answer session?
Yes, I think it's good that we continue, and Dr. Chandra, if you have anything to add, we can have it during the commentary session.
Yeah. Right. All right. Let's move on to actually session 2 on the slightly different topic in association with the recent, Uyghur Tribunal in the UK. But without further, my talk on that, I will start with Dr. Edward Lehman. He's a co-founder of Lehman, Lee and Xu, a law firm in China and Mongolia. He's also the general counsel to AmCham US, first legal counsel to the American Chamber of Commerce, Shanghai, previously elected to both the Board of Governors of American Chamber of Commerce, China, and the Board of Governors of the American Chamber of Commerce, Shanghai, and the chairman and co-founder of Lehman Bush, a private investment bank, and a professor of law. Edward, please.
Great, it's good to be here. Thank you very much for inviting me, and it's great to be a part of a group with such a smart and handsome group of people to be able to discuss a very wide-ranging topic, which is very important today. One of the topic that I'm addressing as a lawyer is this Uyghur Tribunal. I mean, this so-called People's Court, the so-called Uyghur Tribunal, and the idea to kind of unmask it. One thing I learned, I mean, even as a kid, my father would always say that a pancake, no matter how flat it is, always has two sides. And what we are not getting from the Uyghur Tribunal, the so-called People's Tribunal, is that it's not a court. It's actually what we would call a kangaroo court. It's an American terminology. You'd think it would come from Australia, but a kangaroo court is a court that ignores recognized standards of law or justice and carries little or no official standing in the territory where it resides, and is typically convened ad hoc. This kangaroo court is this tribunal, and it ignores due process and has come to a predetermined conclusion. And I'm going to kind of unpack this a little bit, but as ostensibly this kangaroo court terminology with regards to the Uyghur Tribunal, it comes from this idea that it makes leaps like a kangaroo. In other words, jumping over and intentionally ignoring evidence that would be in favor of one party in a predetermined outcome. So that's kind of what our friend, Jeffrey Nice, I'm going to call him a friend because I guess he must be lost, with regards to convening this Uyghur Tribunal, this People's Tribunal, and really conducting what's a show trial. So in essence, there's a predetermined outcome. Jeffrey Nice has been selected for the specific reason that he was leading an international tribunal that actually was an international tribunal. This is no more than a farce. And what it has come up with is a kind of a show trial. And a show trial, just for everybody's edification, is a public trial in which the authorities have already determined the guilt or innocence of a party, which is what they've done with the People's Republic of China with regards to this. The actual trial has as its only goal the presentation of the accusation and the verdict to the public, so they will serve as both an impressive example and a warning. And these show trials tend to be retributive rather than corrective, and they're also conducted for propaganda purposes. So what do we have with the Uyghur Tribunal? Let me just tell you as a lawyer what it is. The Uyghur Tribunal is a company. It's a company limited by guarantee. So it means it's a not-for-profit corporation. There's many such corporations that exist, but it was set up for specific propaganda purposes. So that gets lost in the shuffle in the media and the headlines where they're saying there's this people's tribunal. What people, Mr. Nice? What people? A bunch of actors? What people? A bunch of people making accusations. So what can I tell you for sure? Xinjiang is part of China. Xinjiang people are Chinese people. What's the tribunal? It's actually, like I said, it's a company limited by guarantee. It was funded $150,000 by another company limited guarantee called the World Uyghur Congress, whatever the heck that is. And the Uyghur Tribunal is supposed to be a so-called independent tribunal based in the UK to so-called examine evidence and so-called human rights abuses by the Chinese. But it should be actually under something called the Genocide Convention. So not everybody's referencing the Genocide Convention on a daily basis. So let me unpack it a little bit for you. The word genocide didn't start until in the 1940s. It was by a Polish Jewish lawyer who set out what happened in Europe under what was happening with Nazi Germany and Adolf Hitler. And then in 1948, they codified it under the Genocide Convention. There was actually an avenue in which all these nations had signed up to be able to try this matter. And as I said before, Jeffrey Nice was a lead prosecutor in one of these actions in a trial of Slobodan Milosevic. And this was set forth by the United Nations, okay? Not a company limited by guarantee, but the United Nations itself. It was signed up by members of the treaty, and they went ahead with this thing under an actual law. So the International Criminal Tribunal of former Yugoslavia. And so I think what's been created here, which is a great public relations stunt, it's a great media run, but it's not law. It is just an issue that has been set up in order to try to make China look bad. So there is a law to be able to do it. And like I said, it's under the law of the prevention and punishment of the crime of genocide or the Genocide Convention. When this was founded in 1948, I'll tell you a little interesting anecdote, is that one of the first accusations under this law that was submitted to the UN after the convention was entered into force concerned the treatment of Black Americans, for goodness sakes. The Civil Rights Congress drafted a 237-page petition arguing that even after 1945, the United States had been responsible for hundreds of wrongful deaths, both legal, extra-legal, as well as numerous other genocidal abuses. Leaders from the Black community, and these are well-known people, William Patterson, Paul Robertson, and W.E.B. Du Bois, had presented this petition to the United States in 1951, to the United Nations, I'm sorry, in 1951. However, these accusations were, under the civil rights, and it did not go anywhere. But what my point is that past is prologue, and take a look at what happened back then and what the accusations were back then under this genocide, which is an actual law, not a company limited by guarantee. Now, there's another thing that was brought up in this Uyghur show trial, if you want to call it, that's been going on for some months. And one was the idea of compulsory sterilization. And I just wanted to point this out as a fellow American, as a lawyer, and taking a look at the laws, policies, and regulations that we have in the United States. What is compulsory sterilization? It's known as forced or coerced sterilization, and it's a government mandated program to sterilize a specific group of people. Okay, now, for nearly 30 years, the Supreme Court Justice, there's a guy called Oliver Wendell Holmes, very, very bright guy, probably the brightest guy that was ever on this Supreme Court, wrote a lot of cases about freedom of speech, and freedom of speech is so very important. But one of the cases he did write had to do with a case called Buck versus Bell. And in Buck versus Bell, in a Supreme Court case, It said that 3 generations of imbeciles is enough. That was his quote, saying that there is forced sterilization, which is the law of the land today in the United States. So what I'm trying to do is point out to everybody here that there are laws, that there are policies, that there are regulations, and that they need to be followed in order to come to a conclusion. We don't want, everybody loves a good gossip. Everybody loves a good quote unquote media lynch mob, but people have to, the devil and God are in the details with regards to laws, policies, and regulations. And it simply has not been adhered to with regards to this so-called Uyghur Tribunal. It is not reviewing evidence. It is not an impartial situation. Even in the Nuremberg Trials. So for those of you who know, at Nazi Germany, at the close of World War II, that there was, the Nuremberg Trials were set up, and then there were also trials that were in the Philippines for what happened in Asia for the Japanese. Each of these persons was given a lawyer, Hermann Göring, Rudolf Hess, Albert Speer. These were all given lawyers, and they were all given a chance to bring their case and their evidence. Certainly, there were people that were actually found innocent. There was the head of the economy, a fellow by the name of Schacht. He was represented by legal counsel. There was evidence. It was a legitimate tribunal, and this is not a legitimate tribunal. So what you have here is a bunch of headline-grabbing public relations people that are causing cognitive dissonance using a guy like Jeffrey Nice, who I'm sure is a nice enough person, but just completely misguided to be able to sign, seal, and deliver some kind of, I don't know, proclamation on a bunch of stuff that sounds legitimate, but is completely illegitimate. So China has signed up to the Convention on Genocide. The United States has signed up for it, as have many other nations. And they're not following these laws, policies, and regulations. And the thing is it's a bit of a laugh. And what happens in this crazy world today is that all people do is grab headlines, and nobody's actually unpacking it until it takes some lawyer or legal person to try to unpack and give this idea that this is really not fair. Everybody's entitled to a defense. Everybody's entitled to due process. And there has been none of that for the People's Republic of China with regards to this. This has been brought up, by the way. There have been different states within the United States. There have been different countries that have said that this is genocide and brought this up. Each of them has the right to bring it under the United Nations Genocide Convention. Each of them has not done it, or each of them has failed to do it. So what they need to do is follow the laws, policies, and regulations which the world has established, which the United Nations has established, which and they refuse to do it in order to smear and grab headlines. And so I don't think that that's a very fair way to go about it. And what we're trying to do, everybody deserves advocacy, and that's what we learn in law school. Bad people, people who are accused of different things involve advocacy, and that's how the system can become great, because there is this tension, and it's set out by laws, policies, and regulations that we've all signed up to. The Uyghur Tribunal is not that. It is a charade, and it's unfortunate because there may or may not be something there to it, but it's not the right avenue to go forward with it. Well, with that, I would like to say thank you very much for letting me participate, and I hope to be available if there's any questions or comments further on in the discussion.
Well, thank you, Dr. Lima. Thank you for your wonderful speech, and in particular, providing us with this background information about this trial, and of course, trial of this nature. We know, the keyword is like a, genocide, but of course we haven't found any bodies yet. But anyway, we will continue, and we will come back probably to discuss more about that. We have Dr. Tian Li, assistant professor at the law school, Shandong University, China. His research interests are public international law, international human rights law, and international humanitarian law. His ongoing research is international law and cyberspace. Dr. Li, please.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair Xi, and good afternoon, Mr. President, and highly esteemed colleagues I'm honored to be here in this symposium as an academic junior. Now, in the next 10 minutes or so, I will report to you a preliminary observation I have made about the judgment delivered by the Uyghur Tribunal on Friday. So my report will focus on both the tribunal itself and the judgment. So first of all, for the tribunal itself, now after full reading of the judgment, the same question may be asked by the researchers and practitioners of international alike. What is this tribunal? If the beyond a reasonable doubt standard proof that the tribunal claims to apply, then this should be a criminal type foreign. From legal technical point of view, the standard of proof beyond all reasonable doubt ought not to be applied to establish prima facie responsibility here. So one might say that paragraph 77 of the judgment clearly stated that these individuals' responsibilities are not what this tribunal is mandated to consider. What then is the task of this tribunal? Note that the judgment has spanned 26 pages by this point. One may also argue that in the introduction of the judgment, when paragraph 1, 2 of 1 and 4 were read in conjunction, it becomes clear that this judgment primarily concerned China's state responsibility for the alleged genocide, crimes against humanity, and torture. This is also manifested in paragraphs 7 to 11 of the introduction of this judgment, where the tribunal said that its main task is to determine whether the PRC has been and is attacking with the intent of destroying a part or parts of its own population. If that were the case, then the tribunal would be a judicial body akin to the ICJ. It is important to know that the ICJ in the application of Genocide Convention case, Bosnia versus Serbia, clearly stated that the evidence must be fully conclusive. This is a lower standard than that of international criminal courts or tribunals. Bearing in mind that the tribunal has declared that it will not make any modification to international law in existence. However, my preliminary observation is that this tribunal is attempting to a bold venture in this regard to create a hybrid tribunal. And clearly, what this entails is beyond the capacity of this tribunal, both in theory and in reality. It may also be pointed out that paragraph 5 seemed to indicate that the tribunal acted also as if it were a fact-finding body. The tribunal somewhat recognized this in paragraph 13 of this judgment. Such body, the fact-finding bodies, as this is often found in international human rights law, and one can locate them in the UN Human Rights Charter mechanisms and treaty mechanisms. The mandate of such bodies reveals that they are not empowered to make any legal judgments or even to make attributions in the sense of the law of state responsibility for the acts in question. As far as the working methods of this tribunal, I would say that in paragraph 10, the judgment claims that the tribunal members were working with no preconceptions, whereas the tribunal itself was somehow a product of preconceptions. Let me offer you an example. In footnote number 10 of this judgment, the tribunal used the word granted, followed by the phrase, China is treating the Uyghurs with horrific cruelty. In addition, this is a judgment in which little legal reasoning can be found. For example, the tribunal, it must be considered that address the question of the applicability of the law to some extent. And in paragraphs 145 to 164 provides for the textbook enumeration of the applicable law. Then, as a result, the tribunal should proceed with a convincing legal reasoning on the application of the law, taking into account the facts, rather than immediately following with a conclusion on the legal issue. Furthermore, by the tribunal's own account, no legal or other specialists' knowledge is required to understand the judgment. This can be found in paragraph 3 of this judgment, On the other hand, the judgment was formulated according to the tribunal's account that it is formulated in accordance with international law and international legal norms. International is well known. It is well known that the international law, by its very nature, is an elite study, and is a highly professional branch. Okay, so let me talk about concerning the judgment. Having carefully read the entire judgment, I found that this is a declaratory judgment. In other words, it is a judgment without any operative part. This leaves me at a loss as to what legal purpose this decision is intended to serve, especially when reading after paragraph 187 of the judgment until its very last paragraph. If the tribunals merely sought to draw international attention to the Xinjiang issues, then arguably the so-called great effort the tribunal has made has not yielded more merits. In these paragraphs, the tribunal did not make any ruling on this issue. Instead, it spoke at length about non-legal issues, and the content thereof is more like a political propaganda. As I mentioned earlier, this is completely redundant in terms of the role the tribunal has assigned itself. What is even more worrisome in this phrase, the Uyghur tribunals has repeatedly invited China to participate in its proceedings. This request has been firmly rebuffed by China. China's refusal in itself cannot justify anything I should say in honest, especially not any legitimacy, legal or otherwise, that this tribunal may derive from it. But it seems to convey a certain disturbing sense of political accusation against China. And for the structure of the judgment, this is a structurally incomplete judgment. At least the judgment failed to answer the following question that should have been included in it. Who are the parties to this case? And in particular, the complainants? If complainants do exist, perhaps only the tribunal knows who they are. Then what exactly were the claims? Are individuals who provide witness evidence within the scope of who the tribunal considers to be complainants? Many more questions can be asked regarding this area like this. So for another concern that I have is the substantive content of the judgment. Whether the same sort of acts to which different pieces of evidence point were evaluated rapidly in law, the tribunal did not specify how it applies these evidences, but simply asserted generally that the tribunal, having reviewed all evidence and made primary finding of fact, considered blah, 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 blah. It should be noted that there are many similarities between the genocide and other legal concepts that bear racial characteristics, such as racial discrimination, apartheid, ethnic cleansing, and etc. Please note that here, it is not suggested that China's alleged acts would constitute violations of international law to which these similar concepts refer. They should be examined with great caution. This is also the attitude that current international theory and practice adheres to. In its judgment, the tribunal has recognized that genocide as a concept with a high risk of being inappropriately applied. For example, in footnote number 10, given that the tribunal has claimed from time to time to be working in accordance with international law and international legal norms. Nevertheless, the reasoning of the judgment leading to the conclusion about genocide is absent. I'm afraid that the same holds true for other allegations, for example, the war, the crimes against humanity and the torture. As a conclusion, I would say that this judgment fails to meet the reasonable expectations of international law professionals. This is all I want to say. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Li, for your detailed analysis of this judgment out of this show trial. We will come back, as I said, probably to look at the judgment in detail and have some questions. And let's continue with Dr. Alexei Bykov, Associate Professor of the Department of International Journalism, Graduate School of Journalism and Mass Communications, and the head of Master's Degree Program, International Journalism at St. Petersburg State University. So Dr. Bykov, please.
Good afternoon. At the beginning of the presentation, I would like to thank the organizers for the opportunity to speak and so share my thoughts on topical issues of international politics and mass media practice. Before presentation, I also would like to say that the topic of the Uyghur, what I am going to talk about, is very sensitive and we must discuss it very carefully. This issue is related with ethnic relations, with ethnic identity, with territorial integrity. Any harsh political actions, careless statements can harm the solution of the problem. Based on the historical experience of Russia, we can understand the importance of the complexity of these issues. I must also say that the national question, and in particular the Uyghur problem, is not my main sphere of interests, but I will try to share my thoughts on the assessment of this issue in the media perspective. One of the most discussed issues of recent days is the news about the Uyghur Tribunal. The news comes that Uyghur Tribunal rules that China committed genocide against the Uyghurs and other ethnic minorities. Let's examine a few questions about the problem that are important for assessing media perspectives. Has the Uyghur Tribunal become a media event? What was the purpose of this media event and who can take advantages? Finally, how is the Uyghur Tribunal is covered in the media? Let me give you a few quick remarks on these issues. The first question, has the Uyghur Tribunal become a media event? Definitely yes. We can say that information about it is published in mainstream media and is put on the world agenda. Was it planned in advance to make the Uyghur Tribunal is a significant media event? The answer to this question is also likely to be yes. The word tribunal is perceived as a signal of crimes, as a signal of a significant event, regardless of whether the assembly may or may not make a legal decision. Using the word tribunal to grab public attention, it's a skillful approach. Let's also pay attention to the experts who were involved in it. These are professionals who know how to prepare significant events and create an information agenda. We are talking about the leaders of international organizations and other activists. According to media reports, there were persons from the US government-funded Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation, the US State Department's Radio Free Asia. There were advisors to the US Agency for International Development mission in Central Asia. The participation of professionals and serious funding indicates planned actions. Thus, we have grounds to believe that this is a well-prepared and pre-planned step. The ongoing situation indicates that the tribunal has become a high-profile media event. The second question is, what is the purpose of this event and who can take advantages? Founders of the tribunal indicate the aims to examine evidence regarding China's human rights abuses against the Uyghur people. They say that the tribunal was called when there became no other way to change anything in China with the Uyghur case, but let's also pay attention to a different sequence of events that is associated with this issue. We can suppose that Biden administration and use Xinjiang's case in their policies, and now administration tries to get consent for a diplomatic boycott of the Olympics, which, while largely symbolic, aims to deprive China of attaining and legitimacy from the event. Indeed, the diplomatic boycott is linked to human rights abuses in China. One of the most important cases is the situation in Xinjiang. Thus, the situation with the Uyghurs in China, the Uyghur Tribunal becomes a landmark event. the tribunal finds China guilty. A number of countries have announced a diplomatic boycott of the Beijing Olympics. The decision is justified by the violation of human rights. This topic has already been put on the information agenda. I will also note that the information agenda is not ambiguous. Thanks to diplomatic efforts and media activities of China, a different point of view is heard. For example, in the report of the American television company, CNN, on the decision of the Uyghur Tribunal, different points of view are presented. The reporters note that China's ambassador to the United Kingdom, Zheng Zhiguang, has called the Uyghur Tribunal a political manipulation aimed at discrediting China. Zhao Lijian, a spokesperson for the Chinese Foreign Ministry, has called the tribunal a poor anti-China farce. CNN reports that on Thursday, the Chinese embassy in London called the tribunal a political tool used by a few anti-China elements to deceive and mislead the public. It is not a legal institution, nor does it have any legal authority. He added that the Xinjiang region now enjoys economic progress, social stability, and ethnic solidarity. China will remain focused on doing the right thing and following the path that suits its national reality. This point of view is presented in a report on the CNN website. It indicates the presence in the information field of various information points of view and voice of China. Let's move on the third question. How is the Uyghur Tribunal ruling covered in the media? A quick look at the media coverage of the Uyghur Tribunal reveals an interesting picture. As it turns out, even the American and European media are responding just to news events and are not systematically covering Uyghur issues. This indicates not systematic but fragmentary media coverage of the Uyghur issue. The search was carried out using the keywords Uyghur Tribunal, period 2020-2021, and here are some results. We see different newspapers. For example, in New York Times were published just 4 articles, CNN 7 articles, Times 12 articles, BBC World News few dozens, Russian newspapers, Российская газета, Russian newspaper, only 1 article, and Russian First Channel, 0. These are the search results on the official media sites for the period from 2020 to 2021. Note that the media that were analyzed on their websites do not often publish information about the Uyghur Tribunal. In some media, for example, in the Russian media, Russian newspaper, the journalists cover China positively. Here is a headline, for example, in a central place, the people, Chinese Communist Party, successfully advances human rights. Let's move on the conclusion. We can assume that the frequency of publications is insufficient to form a sustainable public opinion about the Uyghur Tribunal issue. At the same time, this is enough to put the topic on the information agenda. The topic on the information agenda can be an argument for justifying the actions of political actors. Approaches to media coverage of important political issues in different countries are associated with political alliances to which a country belongs. For example, in the official Russian media, the topic of the Uyghur Tribunal is covered rarely and neutrally. In general, China's policy is assessed positively. This is in line with the official policy of strengthening relations between our countries. I thank you.
Well, thank you, Professor Baikov. Thank you for your presentation, from the point of view for journalism, let's say, and in particular, agenda setting with this big political background over there, help people to gain a deeper understanding of the issue. And then next, we have Dr. Sanoji Rajan, a distinguished professor of international law and human rights Zhejiang Gongshan University, China affiliate, Harvard Humanitarian Initiative, Harvard University. Dr. Sanoji Rajan is an accomplished academician, researcher, administrator, and consultant with a PhD in international law and progressive experience working at senior levels in international law and human rights for multiple institutions and countries. Dr. Rajan, please.
Dear fellow panelists, ladies and gentlemen, at the outset itself, let me thank the organizers for giving me this opportunity to express my views on this issue, which is very pressing at this moment. The fellow panelists have raised various pertinent points on the tribunal, the People's Tribunal, the so-called People's Tribunal, including the politics behind it. I would not attempt it again. However, I would like to look into this issue in a different angle. As we know, Uyghur Tribunal is not the first of its kind as a non-state initiated tribunal. The world has already seen people's tribunals like the China Tribunal, the Kuala Lumpur War Crimes Commission, etc. So even though these so-called people's tribunals claim to be judicial institutions using universal jurisdiction, hoping to be an alternative to the institutions like the International Criminal Law and, of course, International Court of Justice for that matter, in reality, they just remains as a tool of advocacy and activism for pressure groups. We can approach these courts in two ways. The first approach is by denying them in total as an advocacy effort and shove them aside, saying that they are just kangaroo courts. Or second way of looking at it is to analyze their structure and approach in a legal way. I think the second way is imminent at this point of time because of the continuous popping up of tribunals like this. So we need to see, of course, these are non-state entities, non-state companies, just like Mr. Lehman was mentioning. It's a non-profit company registered, and they don't have a legal background to constitute a criminal tribunal like this. So it will be really interesting to look into the aspects of the legal aspects, the legal veracity of these kind of organizations. So that is what I'm going to talk in the next 10 or so minutes. Very quickly. As a judicial institution, as they claim to be, they don't have any backing from any state, and their relevance and importance will remain only if they form and follow the norms of judicial institutions elsewhere or at international level. The judicial institutions are relevant only if they follow an established law and procedure. As far as this Uyghur Tribunal of any of this kind of people's code, the law and procedures they use are normally the established international laws and procedures which are available and accepted by majority of the countries in the world. But the way it is being implemented through these codes are questionable. That we all know, the quality of evidence collected, the way the witnesses are being influenced, the biased notions of the judges, etc., all comes under this aspect of using law and procedure accepted by international bodies. Then the qualification and capability of the officers of the court to carry out the functions of the institution is also very important and is very questionable in many of these institutions, in many of these courts, so-called courts. Even though some of the judges and prosecutors are qualified legal practitioners, just like we were talking about Mr. Nice, but most of them are not. And many of them are drawn only because they are associated with the cause for which they are implemented. That we will see as we go ahead discussing further aspects of this analysis. This all diminishes its legal value as a code. Then comes the jurisdiction part, and we all definitely agree that they don't have any jurisdiction to entertain an issue like this. Just to analyze it further, international criminal jurisdiction falls on a subject matter normally on 3 circumstances. There could be other circumstances also, generally on 3 circumstances. One, when the consent of the states through signature and ratification is accurate, which is mostly done by international organizations and international courts. The second one would be the compulsory jurisdiction accorded by an international organization based on a previous treaty obligation, just like ICTY and ICTR got its legal sanctity, just like what has been explained in the Tarish case. The Security Council initiated the establishment of this court, and there's a compulsory jurisdiction on that particular subject matter. And finally, the universal jurisdiction. As we know, the first 2 don't even exist for these kind of institutions. But now coming to the universal jurisdiction, the answer is negative again. The main reason being such privileges are only given to sovereign states. There is no indication under international law, treaties, practice, or customs which entitles a non-state party to exercise universal jurisdiction. And last but not the least, if you look at another important aspect, perhaps the most important aspect of these tribunals, or the test for these tribunals, are lacking of natural justice principles of independence, impartiality, and neutrality in legal adjudication, which is totally not found in these kind of constituted courts, people's courts. No need to mention that independence, impartiality, and neutrality are values which are imposed a duty on adjudicators to be independent, impartial, and neutral, at least as far as this is possible. When we talk about independence, impartiality, and neutrality, we are referring to values, legal principles, institutional conditions, genuine duties held by institutions in first place, and secondly, coming to the second level of independence, impartiality, and neutrality, that is that of adjudicators' own personal nature and their states of mind, which includes their beliefs, desires, their alignment towards a cause, etc. All comes under this. So let's have a look quickly at these 3 important aspects and how they reflect upon organizations like this. Independence, under the influence of positive law, is usually associated with certain institutional guarantees or safeguards that allows adjudicators to free themselves to some extent from external pressure when making their decisions. Such safeguards include, among other things, neutrality of appointment of procedure, the stability of the position, autonomy of the organization, the legal basis of the organization, etc., a reasonable sphere of immunity and inviolability to the judges, etc. If we look at the case of these kind of people courts, external pressure could be immense. It could be from governments, because the speakers before me has talked about how few other countries have influenced the Uyghur Tribunal. So that pressure could be immense after constituting a tribunal for a cause like this, and subsequently deviating from a predetermined judgment is impossible, because you have a huge pressure from the governments who have funded you, who have promoted you in this particular issue. Then public opinion is a big thing where you are situated. Media demands are overwhelming in most of the cases. Then appointment of judges and other officers of the so-called courts are influenced by advocacy interests, for sure, because most of the people who are associated with such courts are none other than the people who work for this advocacy. So the fairness, the independence of their thought process is very much questionable. Then further, the judge's autonomy, that is also influenced because of the same elements, even if that person is from a different context altogether. Because of the pressure which could come from other sources, when he is sitting as a judge would be overwhelming and cannot be retracted. Then coming to the impartiality, in contrast, is usually associated with the objectivity of decision or absence of prejudice towards one or other of the parties. There is also distinction to be made between personal impartiality, which depends on having no stake in the outcome of the proceedings, with the adjudicator simply being one more actor in the conflict that is being resolved, and the institutional impartiality, which is rather more related to what is usually referred to as an independence. So what here we are talking about is the impartiality of the individuals who are involved and the impartiality of the institution as a whole. And we can assume very well that in tribunals like this, both personal impartiality and institutional impartiality are compromised, as the constitution of these kinds of courts are part of advocacy strategies and interests. Last but not the least, the neutrality is normally something which is go in tandem with independence and impartiality. But neutrality may also refer to absence of some kind of nearness, and the judge may have that nearness or affinity or proximity without it necessarily compromising his or her impartiality. So even if, as I was mentioning in the impartiality part of our discussion, even if the judge is from another realm who has nothing to do with the cause which he is judging, his nearness and his proximity to the people who wanted this to be done definitely influences neutrality. So I think all these three are negatively impacting upon the constitution of courts and tribunals like this. The analysis in total shows that the notion of independence, impartiality, and neutrality are elusive in the case of these kind of courts, and the general understanding of illegality of such institutions need to be reinforced. I will stop it there, and I'm happy to come back and answer to any queries that may have in the subsequent discussion part. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Rajan. Thank you for stressing the importance of independence, neutrality, impartiality for any trial in legal practice. So let's proceed to the next session. We have a commentary session. We have 4 commentators to take a look at the presentations by previous speakers. We'll start with Dr. Saeed Mahmood Ali, Associate Fellow, Institute of China Studies from the University of Malaya. Dr. Mahmood has authored 10 books, including a 7-volume series on U.S.-China strategic insecurity dynamics from 1942 to 2016. The 7th, titled China's Belt and Road Vision, Geoeconomics and Geopolitics, was published in early 2020. He is currently writing his 8th volume on U.S.-China mutual strategic insecurity dynamics. Dr. Ali, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and the organizers for inviting me. A very good afternoon to you all. Empirical evidence being central to recent discourse, I'm excerpting US archival records to demonstrate that America's rhetorical emphasis on liberal democratic values in designating China as an authoritarian revisionist threat to their US-led rules-based order belies the history of US-China relations over the past 50 years. The record speaks for itself. 20th May 1971, informing Premier Chou En-lai of US-Soviet anti-ballistic missile negotiations, President Nixon asked NSA Henry Kissinger to inform Premier Chou. President Nixon wishes to emphasize that it is his policy to conclude no agreement which would be directed against the People's Republic of China. Mr. Kissinger is prepared to include this issue and related questions on the agenda of the proposed meeting with the designated representative of the PRC. 9th July 1971, Kissinger to Chou. For the past century, you were victims of foreign oppression. Only today, after many difficulties and separate roads, have we come together again on a basis of equality and mutual respect. We consider that the PRC, because of its achievements, tradition, ideology, and strength, must participate on the basis of equality in all matters affecting the peace of Asia and the peace of the world. 28 February 1972, overnight. Kissinger to Chiao Kuan-hua. Having first provided numbers of Soviet motorized rifle divisions and tank divisions deployed along China's borders, now provided details. Each motorized rifle division has 186 medium tanks, 200 APCs, 4 Frog missile launchers, 144 artillery pieces, that is 54 mortars, 54 122mm howitzers, 18 152mm howitzers, 18 multiple rocket launchers, 28 anti-aircraft weapons, 45 anti-tank artillery, 1178 trucks and tenders. A tank division has 310 medium tanks, 80 APCs, 4 Frog missile launchers, 18 mortars, 60 122mm howitzers, 18 multiple rocket launchers, 68 anti-aircraft weapons, 94 anti-tank artillery, and 1108 general-purpose vehicles. Similar details of Soviet Air Force and missile forces were provided. 13th October 1978, NSA Brzezinski to President Carter. Both the Soviet Union and Vietnam are intent on making China an issue in our relations with them, and this factor will grow rather than diminish with time. Chinese diplomatic activity has become more intense, and the Chinese see their activities as complementary to our long-term interests in offsetting Soviet domination of the southern arc countries from Indochina to southern Africa. 20th December 1978, Nixon to Carter. No reasonable person would question Dr. Brzezinski's assertion that the PRC, because of its control over population and territory, is in fact the government of China. However, the 17 million people in Taiwan who have prospered greatly under a non-communist government have an almost fanatical core of support in the nation, the USA, and Congress. It is essential that you give additional reassurances firmly and unequivocally that the USA will protect Taiwan. 31st December 1978, Carter to Hua Guofeng. The United States desires a world of diversity in which each nation is free to make a distinctive contribution to express the manifold aspirations, cultures, traditions, and beliefs of mankind. The American people value the enormous contributions the Chinese people have made to the achievements of humanity, and we welcome the growing involvement of the PRC in world affairs. We consider China as a key force for global peace. 25th January 1979, Brzezinski to Carter. The US-Chinese-Soviet triangle will require particularly delicate management. Brezhnev's goal is to get us to assign primacy to our Soviet relationship while keeping China poor, weak, and isolated. Heightened Soviet-American tension would best serve Deng because it would increase China's tactical value to the US and would shift a portion of the burden for resisting Moscow from China to the US. Our interest is to improve relations with both Peking and Moscow and to avoid allowing one to use us against the other, unquote. 18 years of tacit US-China alliance followed. Arguably, China under Mao and Deng was much more communist or socialist and authoritarian than it has been since. That did not matter then. Official US grand strategic documents make clear US displacement anxiety is driving policy. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. Ali. Next, we have Dr. Julia Rocknifant, Assistant Professor at the School of Politics, History, and International Relations, University of Nottingham, Malaysia. Prior to that, she was the Director for Foreign Policy at EMIR Research, Kuala Lumpur-based think tank. She has served as a research fellow at the National Research University Higher School of Economics in 2010 to 2019, and is currently a consultant with the PIR Center, a Moscow-based think tank specialized in international security and nuclear non-proliferation. Julia, please.
Thank you so much to the moderator and to Mr. Kinky and to the organizers of this wonderful event today. And it's great that we all, despite it being the weekend, could get together to discuss the two important events of the recent days. I'd say it's quite a long introduction for actually a short intervention that I'm going to make, but nevertheless, thank you so much for honoring it. I would like to say a few words about what I think on the topic, and also to give a couple of comments on what has been said today in the course of our event. So to me, the two matters that the democracy summit, the Joe Biden's democracy summit, and also the tribunal on the plight of Uyghurs in China, they should be seen in a larger context, in the context of all of us, well, in the first place, academics, researchers, analysts, but also members of political establishment, trying to grasp the new contours of the international system, which is in a state of rapid change at the moment, and which definitely departed from the state of bipolar system, and even from the monopolarity which we could imagine for a short period of time, to the state of how some colleagues would name it pre-chaos, slowly sliding into a sort of chaos, which me also I'm envisioning this pessimistic prospect for the international system in a matter of a couple of decades. So for the reasons that it's quite hard to put it in a certain framework, and since we've departed from the frameworks in which we traditionally used to look at the international system, I would like to draw your attention to probably two major trends which we are encountering right now. First of all is the importance of identity and values within the international system. However, when we, on the one hand, we see that how much identities and not only as per the constructivist paradigm, but in real life, identities, values, ethics, and morals started to matter more for the past couple of decades. But at the same time, we see this development mostly going on at the grassroots level, to be later on capitalized on by the politicians in their policymaking. So at the same time, we have a contradicting trend of politicians, members of political establishment in formulating their policies, adopting a very much realpolitik approach, which we thought and hoped we would more or less depart from, but turns out that we didn't, and it proves to be the more suitable one in the current state of pre-chaos or sliding into chaos. So we've had several demonstrations of what has been happening recently, and it's not only about China, the United States standoff. It's not only about speculations about us entering into the state of Cold War 2.0, but in day-to-day matters, for example, in how the European Union tackled the immigration crisis. If we look at it closely at several operations, for example, in Mediterranean, search and rescue focus of those operations conducted by Italy, funded by the EU, has been abandoned quite quickly, with this focus being shifted towards preservation of border security and sovereignty eventually. And several subsequent operations that we'll look at in the Mediterranean, they were targeting preservation of the border security in the first place, rather than human security. We can see this in the disparity of information coverage of migration crisis in the EU itself and in the Middle East, which turns to be hosting the majority of refugees. But we can see in the matter of coverage, it would look like the problem is much more conspicuous for the EU rather than for the such countries as Lebanon, Jordan, or Turkey, most of all, hosting the majority of refugees fleeing the Syrian war. Syrian and the conflict in Yemen as well. in terms of information disparity, we wouldn't, especially here located in Southeast Asia, we wouldn't need to go far. You could see how fast the focus of attention shifted from the Myanmar and plight of Rohingyas and other minorities in Myanmar to other matters. And in fact, look at what has been high up in the international agenda for the past days. We don't discuss matters. We much more rarely discuss matters of human security, plight of migrants, refugees, minorities being oppressed. But instead, we are discussing matters of arms control, which are still high up in the agenda. For the past days, we've been all looking at how negotiations on the pretty much constructed problem of Iran's nuclear program are being going on and in fact failing, not reaching to any sort of successful conclusion. And it's going to stay the way for the foreseeable perspective. On the other hand, also we don't have to go far. We can look at the United States outlook at the regional matters. We are, in a couple of days, we will be visited by, at least as per what's being announced, if there's no change of plans, we are going to be visited by Secretary Blinken. And for a number of reasons, I suppose that, which I'm not sure from which party they are coming from, but it's not being very widely advertised. Probably because we traditionally here in Southeast Asia are tending to take up proposals on that part of security which is stemming from economic background, economic benefits, and at this moment Malaysia still prefers to maintain its ties, its economic ties with China without upsetting its very much valuable partner. But we will see in a couple of days what comes out of this visit. And why I'm mentioning that, because we've already had more high-profile visits. President Obama visited Malaysia and Southeast Asia a couple of times. And at the time, I happened to be a member of CSO group, and many times CSO members asked President Obama, also the members of the Department of State who came to prepare for his visit a month or two prior to this visit, and they would consult to the major representatives of CSO community in Malaysia. How can we help you? What should we tell your prime minister to help you with your work in what concerns human security issues, human rights? And there were many proposals. And one of them, to me, the most outstanding one was threaten the government, Najib at the time, threaten them with economic sanctions. How you do in the other cases which are important to you. And I really doubt that it was ever done, because the priority for the US government at the moment, and I bet still now, was lying elsewhere. And probably this is going to be on the agenda of Secretary Blinken in the upcoming visit, to see how Malaysia can be swayed, Malaysia and its partners in Southeast Asia can be swayed rather towards the aspirations of the United States and not China. So this is in what comes to the matters of human security, including those like the plight of Uyghurs, the plight of Rohingyas here in the region. And I don't see the reason to think that there are any morals considered in this kind of approach. I would like to express my appreciation to what Professor Gail Luft said about that we need to let countries figure out for themselves, based on their culture and their economy, figure out for themselves what path they would choose for their development, as well as I think very much echoing that statement by Professor Jayanath, that we need to leave it to the system of international institutions, the United Nations, United Nations Charter, and sovereignty still needs to be the presiding principle in the international system. Well, I would agree with our esteemed speakers on that pretty much. However, we also should remember that the international system itself, the system of global governance, finds itself in a state of crisis. On the one hand, we have the international institutions which do not prove on a number of occasions to be very effective, especially in addressing problems like minorities being oppressed in a variety of countries, because simply it wasn't on the amongst the top priorities of respective governments. We've seen Security Council being weakened by the continuous and increasing use of veto power, also because of the adversities within the members, between the members of the UN Security Councils, one of the highest institutions that could actually put words into action. While ascertaining the sovereignty of states as the highest priority in the current international system, and I think it seconds many positions of many international actors at the current moment, I would also not discount the importance of how international community reacts to what's happening in the world. And with the trend of people indeed caring much more about their own problems, people adopting this spectator sport outlook at what's happening in the world. And as speakers here already noticed, that for many people in remote countries, it doesn't matter either it's applied of Rohingyas in Myanmar or it's applied of refugees fleeing Syrian or Yemeni wars, and then the countries that host them, and the problem of Uyghurs in China's Xinjiang. So I wouldn't say that I wouldn't discount the importance of that, because we need to start from somewhere, and if governments don't care, we at least have grassroots level to rely on. However, I wouldn't also give, provided the current state of international system, the spectator sport attitude and the overall dispersed attention, as we can see in the media. I think Dr. McAfee here also outlined it very well. The interest to such matters is quite low. So what we are trying here to do is to simply tackle the narrative which the United States are trying to enhance and promote on the Uyghur issue, and not more than that. I think it will, in a couple of days, the attention to this matter will simply dissipate, how it dissipated to the Uyghur Tribunal in the same way. On the other hand, and I would like to finish my intervention with this, I still wanted to say a couple of words on the matter of Uyghurs itself. And I think I've been observing our Chinese colleagues also trying to find a suitable way how to tackle the anti-China propaganda, also using this sort of weak spot. And if I may, I find it a little bit crude. First of all, we need to understand that it at least provided the history of similar incidents. I think there is an understanding that there is not going to be a forceful military intervention in order to rescue the oppressed minorities within China. So how we are going to tackle this is at the information field. And so far, China has been losing this battle in a way, not losing completely, but definitely having reasons to criticism, because the approach to this was quite crude. And I would echo what Dr. Gail Luft here said, that show the world that your people live well. And this kept coming again and again in my talks with our Chinese colleagues, that show the world that if ever there was a problem, you were able to rectify it. The approach to this needs to be more subtle in order to dispel the accusations, either they are true or not. The crude approach would be failing Chinese side in this propaganda war. And propaganda, by saying propaganda, I don't necessarily mean it in a pejorative sense of the word. So the approach to this needs to be subtle. We understand there's not going to be military intervention to decide. The attention to the tribunal is going to dissipate in a couple of days. But what can be done is the approach to propaganda on this front needs to be more subtle, more proof, probably needs to be more substance to the Chinese rhetoric needs to be provided in order for it to be successful. And I think colleagues who are dealing with journalism here would agree with me on that. And that would also, I think, fit very well in the current trends which the international system is moving towards, since many battles are being fought in the information front rather than anywhere else. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Julia. You mentioned about the information disparity, and this is a case actually in terms of an information disparity. For any country, if you say on the competition with the US, UK, and the Five Eye media, and you compete with them in their native language, English, it's very difficult, I guess, to win an information war, for example. But anyway, this is a question we should realize, I guess, for China to do a better job to present their case to the international community. This reminds me also about this, the time running up to the Iraq war. Almost all US media, every American were mobilized to support the war, with a strong belief there's weapons of mass destruction. And later on, what we find until today, there's no weapons of mass destruction being discovered. For Chinese, they would say this is the case with Uyghur people in China. If you compare the living standard of Uyghur people to the Black people, for example, in the US, you can see which group of people is living a happier life, probably. Unfortunately, yes, I guess I agree with you that Chinese should do a better job over there. But let's move on. Next, we have Mr. Howard Huxter, as English teacher at Beijing Normal University, Hong Kong Baptist University, United International College. He's a British citizen with living and working experience in the UK, France, Netherlands, New Zealand, Canada, China. Probably Mr. Howard. Howard is a person with authority to compare and judge with his wide extensive experience. Howard, please.
Well, it was, I sort of learned a lot, I think. I particularly thought Professor Jayanath was interesting when he said that, there is no universal democracy. It's different, wherever you are. And certainly in Britain, we have a different idea of liberty, freedom, democracy, whatever you want to call it, than even France, where I was working for a long time, and other countries. The voting system is different. So, he was quite right. And I think that is, the word democracy is kind of bandied around a lot as a sort of universal thing. And I don't think it's like that. I quite like the word liberty, which, if I can quote George Orwell, he said that if liberty means anything at all, it means the right to tell other people what they don't want to hear. We certainly do that a lot in the UK. And then another point is that when I lived in Canada and I was in America, there was a book at that time, back in the 70s, called The Greening of America by Charles Reich. And that is when, after reading it, I decided, I thought that the real problem is not politics, it's big business. And big business are trying the same model. I would have hoped that with the COVID virus, the business would have had the chance to reorientate itself. And there's no sign that that's happening. There is if anyone's interested, a French economist called Piketty, who's just written a book, and he has a new model of economics, which is quite different to the established one. So I think that is the thing. And also, I also like to mention that what a lot of people have forgotten about is the Limits to Growth, which was the Club of Rome's first book back in the 70s. And I believe it got a bad press, and I believe that this was due to business, actually, you know, and they didn't like this. They said the model made at MIT wasn't good, and I think it was good. And now people are talking about it again. You know, that is the three limits to growth are population, the environment, and leisure. Leisure being, you know, the coming of AI, meaning they would be doing our jobs. And there was a second report to the Club of Rome, which I actually interviewed the co-author, Edward Pastel, called Mankind at the Turning Point. And now it's like now we are at the turning point. And it didn't get published as a book. I don't even know if it's available online. I think there was a review of it somewhere I found, but it didn't get published as a book. And sometimes now you might find people have realized that the Club of Rome had the right idea and that they were, you know, on the right path. And as a rider to that, I mean, talking about big business, anyone who knows about the recent COP26 in Scotland, the biggest delegation there were from the fossil fuels industry. And so, you know, I'm basically saying that politics carries on as sort of normal, really, but the real threat to us, to life on Earth is big business, actually. So there we go. Thank you for inviting me. I could say a lot more, but I guess we're running a bit late, so yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, Howard. Thank you. Next, we have Dr. Wumeng Yang, Distinguished Research Fellow from Global Governance Institution. Dr. Wu graduated as a joint PhD in International Human Rights Law from the Graduate School of Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, CAS, and Utrecht University in the Netherlands. Dr. Wu, please.
Thank you. Sorry, I look like this. The camera of my laptop is in the left corner of the screen. I'm honored to have this opportunity to attend this dialogue, and I enjoyed very much the interesting topics and valuable insights offered by all the speakers. Regarding democracy, I agree with Dr. Gail Luft and Kalmbach that it should be the people to decide whether the system is working and what is democracy. And there are more than one definition and understanding of democracy. And it is not IKEA furniture that could be put together anywhere according to the same instructions. And for many developing countries, small countries like Dr. Muzaffar said, the important question is how to make people's lives better, right? Suffer less, to benefit from a more just world order, a more balanced world. And regarding the so-called Uyghur Tribunal, I agree with Dr. Lemon and Dr. Tian. It is basically a show trial or propaganda. It is not a judicial body, but it tries to look like one and calls itself an independent people's tribunal. So it leaves an impression of impartiality and independence. And these are very important, impartiality and independence, as Dr. Jayanath said, to a real tribunal, right? But we're not really talking about a real court. And personally, I do cast certain doubts on the impartiality of both some of the judges and also witnesses, and also the credibility and reliability of the evidence. For example, I think in one of the report used as evidence, I think there was somehow linked the 5-year plan, let me see what is called, 5-year plan of the textile clothing industry to coercive labor transfer. And it just makes me wonder, like, whether they will do the same, like if the US Department of Labor or state governments announce any long-term plan or program to boost the economy or employment, you know, will that be interpreted into like measures forcing people to do labor or something like that? But I do agree with Dr. Bykov, that these are professionals and they do know how to launch information propaganda, and this incident has been widely covered by different media, even though some reports and information shared by the expert witnesses and organization, non-governmental organization are not new, and they were just sharing them again. But for me, it's really like a one-way storytelling. But put aside all these accusations and finger pointing, I think in the end, what is more important is what Chinese people feel, right? I think human rights propaganda and human rights are different things, and human rights never really happens in Geneva or New York. So I think what is more important is the lives of Chinese people and how China actually fulfills its obligations under international treaties. We're parties of the ICESCR, the Convention Against Torture, Genocide Convention. So I think more important is how China actually fulfills these legal obligations, and only concrete and substantive protection and promotion of Chinese human rights, I think that counts. Okay, that's all for me. Thank you for your attention.
Well, thank you, Dr. Wu. At the last part, we will have Captain Tian to have some concluding remarks. Captain Tian, can we, before you start the speech, can we have like 10 minutes Q&A session? Qingqi, do you agree? Let's have some.
10 minutes if there's any question.
Yeah, if there's any question, please raise your hand and you can ask it directly. Direct your question to the individual speaker, or as a general question, see any speaker will want to pick up to answer your question. Can I abuse my position as a moderator to ask the first question?
Yeah.
I have a question for Dr. Gail Luft. With President Biden has said that during the UN speech, he said with some in an emotional way, I'm not looking for a Cold War or creating rigid blocks in the world. But if you look at what his policy toward China, for example, Democracy Summit, and also the boycott to the Beijing Winter Olympics, some people would say, you are doing exactly the opposite of what you have said. In what way? I'm wondering, the Democracy Summit will further distance Washington from Beijing and Moscow. People would see that as a part of the effort to contain Beijing and Moscow.
Yes, I think that one of the sort of least discussed issue in his decision-making is the local politics, domestic politics. I really believe him. I really believe that he does not want a Cold War. He does not want to escalate, but he's a weak president. He's deeply unpopular. He is challenged not only by Republicans, but also from his own base, the progressive wing of the Democratic Party, with all of its intricacies and agendas. So he is like a gazelle in the savannah surrounded by hungry lions. And I think that much of what he's doing on China is just a way of his showing that he's not weak on China. I think that this whole, for example, boycott on the Olympics has a lot to do with his way of showing that he's doing something, because not doing anything would be perceived as a weakness, and it would have exposed him to a very intense criticism. And let's not forget that the midterm elections is an incredibly important moment in American politics, because if he loses either the House or the Senate or both, he becomes a lame duck president right there. And there's so many challenges that he has to deal with domestically. And China is the easy target, is because it's the only area, the only issue where he can enjoy support from both parties. So I really believe him. He does not want a Cold War. He does not want to be, he has you know, with anything happens with Iran and with Russia and Ukraine and the border issues and the inflation and COVID, he has more than enough to deal with. But unfortunately, his tendencies toward China, to me, are a reflection of his inability to claim his own independent agenda and always being dragged by the political forces at play. And this is what it's all about.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Luft. We'll see any questions from the audience, any questions from other speakers to the colleagues.
You know, I had a question there,
Edward.
if you don't mind.
Ahead.
Yeah, hey, good to be a part of the group. And you know, to shout out to Malaysia down there and Dr. Julia Rokenford there. You were saying that China's kind of done it ham-handedly, or you know, their approach hasn't been the best one. Well, I mean, what would be your suggestion for them otherwise to go forward? I mean, I'm just interested. I don't necessarily agree with you. I mean, disagree with you. I would say that this is a new role for China to try to react to different things that are going on around the world. But I'm just curious as to what solutions you might offer to the Chinese to rectify that.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Edward. May I just specify what exactly you disagree with me on?
No, I didn't disagree. I was saying that you were saying that that maybe their approach has not been as good as it could be, perhaps, and unless I misunderstood your comments. And what this is the constant thing. I mean, I've moved to China in the 1980s. I've been resident in China ever since that time. I've sort of seen a little bit of what's gone on during that time, the greatest economic transformation in the history of the world. This dichotomy of moving from sort of a third world nation into a first world nation, into being a nation that could be the strongest economy in the world. I think that they are, one thing I can say is, having been a legal professional here, they actually open up the doors to us and say, hey, we're writing a law, we're writing a policy, we're writing a regulation. Hey, world, hey, guys, hey, people here. You know, what are your recommendations on writing this law, policy, and regulation? And they, you know, they talk to different think tanks and whatnot. What I'm saying is that there is a certain amount of willingness, I think, to listen to where they might be making mistakes and then backtrack. And the one thing that's been great about the policies in China is that they're, you know, they can be done with one voice, they can be done kind of quickly, but they can also be changed very quickly too if they see it's not working for them. I mean, this is my own personal observation. So I'm not disagreeing. I'm just saying, where could they improve? You mentioned that there might be some level of interaction that might be better.
Thank you for sharing your perspective. It's always valuable, and I'm not saying it just for the courtesy. I was talking about the information field in particular. And of course, well, I won't dramatize it to say that my heart bleeds for China, but definitely I can see that China is attempting certain effort, but it looks like maybe not enough. And maybe I will bring up an example which illustrates what I'm trying to say better. At some point, I think a couple of years back, maybe 3 years back, I remember that China tried to sponsor efforts searching for analysts, academics, publicists, mostly people who publish it, get it out there in the mainstream, not so mainstream media in different countries, from the Middle East throughout Southeast Asia to Eastern Europe, trying to think how an alternative narrative could be suggested on Xinjiang, on Uyghurs. And even in Malaysia, there is quite a complexion of how media, how analysts, and even politicians approach it. And usually it's interest-driven, economic interest-driven most of the times. We try to help. Some colleagues tried to come up with suggestions like how it can be done subtly, because we are dealing, on the one hand, we are dealing with the Western, and again, I don't want to demonize anything, but it's a big media machinery, very professional, very skillful in how to subtly suggest and push for an argument. On the China side, when colleagues try to propose something very subtle, for example, let's say starting to ask questions, like why in the first place this matter of Uyghurs came up, what are they trying to achieve? And second part of it could have been China providing a proof, to providing more substantial, more convincing proof, rather than just simply trying to dispel the argument, that wave of arguments coming from the West by saying that no, nothing like this is happening, and we're simply not willing to even discuss this. That's what I mean in what it should be more subtle. And at that point, our Chinese colleagues were not very receptive towards these kind of suggestions, to make it more subtle, for it not to look like a very crude counter propaganda. And experts are here, experts not only in international relations, but most of all, I guess I'm referring to experts in the media studies, in journalism, and they might be underutilized for this cause. And speaking of this, I guess we've had examples of various countries also having kind of their own internal issues, and a lot of the battle is going on in the information battlefield. And we could also look at that experience, how it was done. I'm not saying to condone cases of if something is really happening, but since we're dealing with it in the information battlefield, the methods of dealing with it should be thought of accordingly.
Great. No, I mean, thank you very much for that. No disagreement. I think again, it's a brave new world for the Chinese to try to speak up in media setting worldwide, and I think that it's coming. It has some improvement to be made, and I don't disagree. Sometimes you get a top-down kind of a decision-making situation where you think you're having dialogue with people on a particular topic on how to better move forward their agenda. And those people are not the decision makers, unfortunately. It's people who you're not speaking with sometimes, which I think leads to frustration for think tanks and other types of folks until those decisions are made. So yeah, thank you very much for those comments.
Thank you, Edward. Thank you, Julia. We come to the ending part of the discussion. We will invite Captain Tianshi Chen, the founder and the president of Global Governance Institution, to give us the concluding remarks. Captain Tian, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, for your wonderful moderation. I want to thank all our participants for their brilliant, well-considered, and unique insights. I'm sure that our audiences have also felt the same. Thanks also go to our co-organizer, the Center for New Inclusive Asia, and in particular, President Ko King-Ki. This dialogue would not have been so successful without your tremendous efforts. After hearing all these excellent remarks, I'm inspired to share a few points. First, democracy is diversified and not necessarily equivalent to good governance. Even among the West, democracy in Northern Europe is different from that of East Europe. Singapore is not invited to the Summit for Democracy and may deem authoritarian regime by the United States as host. However, it is commonly agreed that the Singaporean people live a happy and prosperous life under this regime. Not to see the truth that in history, all the four Asian dragons realized economic boost actually under single-party ruling at that time. Second, human rights is a process and not an end. When the U.S. Human Rights Alliance examines China's human rights issues, it always makes a horizontal comparison between the East and West with a magnifying glass. and never observes China's changes from a vertical perspective. Taking myself for example, when I was born in a rural village in Shandong province, the house is made of mud, and the only electronic appliance in the house is a torch. The government-led poverty eradication campaign have brought great changes to my hometown, which goes beyond my words. Even in the West, the natives of America, the Inuits of Canada, and the Aborigines of Australians all are examples of areas of improvement for the Holy West Alliance human rights protection. Third, law is a guarantee of people's rights and not a tool to be weaponized against people. The allegation of genocide in Xinjiang, China, by the Uyghur Tribunal is not alone. In recent years, this obsolete legal term, coined by a Polish lawyer back in 1944, was rejuvenated in the former Yugoslavia, Rwanda, Sudan, and Burma. All these cases point to the single fact that none of the allegations targeted the West. However, it is admitted even by themselves that atrocities were committed against the native Indians in America, Inuits in Canada, and Aborigines in Australia. I think the answer speaks for itself. I very much want to invite our speakers to Xinjiang to see the truth with their own eyes, because we as lawyers believe that any accusation should be based on law and facts. Finally, I would call upon all countries to try to resist the Tokwokwe arguments. Atrocities in other countries do not make excuse for you to violate international law in your own country. It is the obligation of our international scholars to fight against the politicizing of democracy, to fight against double standards in human rights, and to fight against weaponizing of international law. Given the pandemic and climate change as common threats, I strongly call upon international community to put a stop to the big power competition so that resources could be saved into cooperation in relieving people from being mistreated. Thank you all.